So, still in chapter 26, the ascent towards supermind. So we noted that the power of resistance to the descent, to the intermingling of the higher mind consciousness with our vehicle here, with the constitution of our mental and vital physical body, is such that it often stymies our advance. The power of resistance is formidable. It's rooted in the ignorance, in the originating inconscience from which begin in this universe. Not originating in the original sense, but still the origination of the evolutionary march forward is out of the inconscient. So all that is down there in that dark chaos still has a claim on our being, and it is only the highest light that can transform that, while the higher mind is an illuminated consciousness, is instinct with what is real. It is still only of the substance of thought. And so while it can influence matter, it cannot transform it. It can brighten our lives, and it does, both pacify and brighten our lives, but it is not capable of changing, ultimately, what needs to be changed. So let's just read that last sentence where we ended last time. This power of persistence, recurrence, resistance of established things in nature is always the great obstacle which the evolutionary force has to meet when it has indeed itself, which it has indeed itself created, in order to prevent a too rapid transmutation, even when that transmutation is its own eventual intention in things. This obstacle will be there, even though it may progressively diminish at each stage of this greater ascent. In order to allow it all to the higher light an adequate entry and force of working, it is necessary to acquire a power for quietude of the nature, to compose, tranquilize, impress a controlled passivity, or even an entire silence on mind and heart, life and body. But even so, a continued opposition, overt and felt in the force of the universal ignorance, or subliminal and obscure in the substance energy of the individual's make of mind, his form of life, his body of matter, an occult resistance, or a revolt or reaffirmation of the controlled or suppressed energies of the ignorant nature is always possible, and if anything in the being consents to them, they can resume dominance. So this is quite an inventory. We must develop the power to calm the vehicle, so to speak. But even so, we feel it from all around us in the universal atmosphere, in the universal world. The opposition to this advance, we find it in ourselves, in our own subconscious. We find it operative in the hidden forces at play in the universe. And they can always reassert themselves, even if we seem to have won the day, to have calmed things and established luminosity in the moment. It is not a final victory. He goes on, a previously established psychic control is very desirable is that creates a general responsiveness and inhibits the revolt of the lower parts against the light or their consent to the claims of the ignorance. A preliminary spiritual transformation will also reduce the hold of the ignorance, but neither of these influences altogether eliminates its obstruction and limitation. For these preliminary changes do not bring the integral consciousness and knowledge. The original basis of nescience proper to the inconscient will still be there, needing at every turn to be changed, enlightened, diminished in its extent and in its force of reaction. So we have to calm and gladden the nature, be prepared to meet the resistance. So far, if we have attained psychic realization and extended that into play in the nature and have effected a kind of transformation, so far as we have extended beyond that and brought down the spiritual influence of a realized consciousness from the timeless, from the eternal, into the nature, widening it and preparing and purifying it, we have made great strides. But there can still be failure in spite of these tremendous achievements. Look at this. This is establishing great powers of spiritual realization, which the treasury of our spiritual literature has kept before us always as examples to be followed. And yet, if we attain these things, they are mere preliminary steps. None of it is sufficient to the larger transformation that Sri Aurobindo envisages as the natural spiritual culmination of the line of conscious evolution. He goes on, the power of the spiritual higher mind and its idea force, modified and diminished as it must be by its entrance into our mentality, is not sufficient to sweep out all these obstacles and create the Gnostic being. But it can make a first change, a modification that will capacitate a higher ascent and a more powerful descent, and further prepare an integration of the being in a greater force of consciousness and knowledge. Gnostic being, being of knowledge. This greater force is that of the illumined mind, a mind no longer of higher thought, but of spiritual light. Here, the clarity of the spiritual intelligence, its tranquil daylight, gives place or subordinates itself to an intense luster, a splendor and illumination of the spirit, a play of lightnings of spiritual truth and power breaks from above into the consciousness and adds to the calm and wide enlightenment and the vast descent of peace, which characterize or accompany the action of the larger conceptual spiritual principle, a fiery ardor of realization and a rapturous ecstasy of knowledge. So you have a lot of notations here about illumination, play of lightnings, fiery ardor, what is commonly seen in the Veda, Agni, the fire within that burns incessantly in the heart without fuel, as we read in the Sri Lalita Sahasranama. The fire that is on the hearth, the lightning which plays in the sky, the sun above all, the moon, all these different facets of illumination are expressions of a single reality and are cognate with each other. So here, again, we're speaking about a great consciousness based in peace and light, tranquil daylight, play of lightnings, etc. A downpour of inwardly visible light very usually envelops this action. For it must be noted that contrary to our ordinary conceptions, light is not primarily a material creation, and the sense or vision of light accompanying the inner illumination is not merely a subjective visual image or a symbolic phenomenon. Light is primarily a spiritual manifestation of the divine reality, illuminative and creative. Material light is a subsequent representation or conversion of it into matter for the purposes of the material energy. There is also in this descent the arrival of a greater dynamic, a golden drive, a luminous enthusiasmos of inner force and power, which replaces the comparatively slow and deliberate process of the higher mind by a swift, sometimes a vehement, almost a violent impetus of rapid transformation. So let's back up. Material light represents that principle in matter. Principle of illumination in matter. Just so, Sri Aurobindo interprets all the Vedic deities as being corollaries. They have physical stations, you might say. They have functions that they perform inside the universe, but they all represent inner and conscious powers, really. So that all that we meet in the universe is symbolic of some greater reality. It is not just stuff shaped here and there in this way or that way. Everything is bristling with significance. This last sentence, very interesting. There is also in this descent the arrival of a greater dynamic, a luminous enthusiasmos, the Greek word which means God-inspired zeal, which comes racing through and takes seizure of the being and affects a change. It is that power of consciousness which would be cognate both with Mahasaraswati and with Mahakali, the great inspiration that comes winging in and the force which insists on its implantation in matter. He's given it a special status by putting it in quotes. Instead of calling it enthusiasm, he takes it back to the Greek, enthusiasmos. The illumined mind does not work primarily by thought, but by vision. Thought is here only a subordinate movement expressive of sight. Now note that in his description of the illumined mind, it does not discard the higher mind, nor any of the elements of the nature leading all the way down to the body. They are integrated into it, but now ruling the day is illumination, not mere thought, but the illumined substance of the illumined mind. The human mind, which relies mainly on thought, conceives that to be the highest or the main process of knowledge, but in the spiritual order, thought is a secondary and a not indispensable process. We'll find that it's necessary to use thought, and that's why higher mind exists, to transmit truth to the ratiocinative mind, so that it can say, aha, now I get it, and keep unbroken the whole flow down to material creation. In its form of verbal thought, it can almost be described as a concession made by knowledge to the ignorance, because that ignorance is incapable of making truth wholly lucid and intelligible to itself in all its extent and manifold implications, except through the clarifying precision of significant sounds. It cannot do without this device to give to ideas an exact outline and an expressive body. And we could enter here language theory, which Sri Aurobindo, coming out of the late 19th century, was a master of. Of course, things have developed much in over a century since then. But it is evident that this is a device, a machinery. Thought in itself, in its origin on the higher levels of consciousness, is a perception, a cognitive seizing of the object or of some truth of things, which is a powerful but still a minor and secondary result of spiritual vision, a comparatively external and superficial regard of the self upon the self, the subject upon itself, or something of itself as object. For all there is a diversity and multiplicity of the self. And yes, you have heard this argument before in the early chapters in the Life Divine, where he was describing the nature of the supermind as it moves from its unitive primary poise into its secondary and then into its tertiary form. You can go back and review. In mind, he writes, there is a surface response of perception to the contact of an observed or discovered object, fact or truth, and a consequent conceptual formulation of it. But in the spiritual light, there is a deeper perceptive response from the very substance of consciousness, and a comprehending formulation in that substance, an exact figure or revelatory ideograph in the stuff of the being. Nothing more, no verbal representation is needed for the precision and completeness of this thought knowledge. An ideograph, it's a symbol that stands for the thing itself, not as a representative word one step farther away, but is the thing itself. Thought creates a representative image of truth. It offers that to the mind as a means of holding truth and making it an object of knowledge. But the body itself of truth is caught and exactly held in the sunlight of a deeper spiritual sight, to which the representative figure created by thought is secondary and derivative, powerful for communication of knowledge, but not indispensable for reception or possession of knowledge. So, one with the illumined consciousness will have this primarily and then distribute it perhaps to the lower reaches of intellectual capacity through thought form. Fill thought form with significance and power and substance, but it does not need it itself. A consciousness that proceeds by sight, the consciousness of the seer, is a greater power for knowledge than the consciousness of the thinker. Yes. The rishi is greater than the philosopher. The perceptual power of the inner sight is greater and more direct than the perceptual power of thought. It is a spiritual sense that seizes something of the substance of truth and not only her figure. But it outlines the figure also and at the same time catches the significance of the figure, and it can embody her with a finer and bolder revealing outline and a larger comprehension and power of totality than thought conception can manage. As the higher mind brings a greater consciousness into the being through the spiritual idea and its power of truth, so the illumined mind brings in a still greater consciousness through a truth sight and truth light and its seeing and seizing power. It can effect a more powerful and dynamic integration. It illumines the thought mind with a direct inner vision and inspiration, brings a spiritual sight into the heart, and a spiritual light and energy into its feeling and emotion, imparts to the life force a spiritual urge, a truth inspiration that dynamizes the action and exalts the life movements. It infuses into the sense a direct and total power of spiritual sensation so that our vital and physical being can contact and meet concretely quite as intensely as the mind in emotion can conceive and perceive and feel the divine in all things. It throws on the physical mind a transforming light that breaks its limitations, its conservative inertia, replaces its narrow thought power and its doubts by sight, and pours luminosity and consciousness into the very cells of the body. In the transformation by the higher mind, the spiritual sage and thinker would find his total and dynamic fulfillment. In the transformation by the illumined mind, there would be a similar fulfillment for the seer, the illumined mystic, those in whom the soul lives in vision and in a direct sense and experience. For it is from these higher sources that they receive their light, and to rise into that light and live there would be their ascension to their native empire. And let's note that a mystic, from the Greek mystikos, means an initiate, one who has been initiated, one who is a knower of secrets by direct contact with the divine principle. So there is in the mystic experience an unmistakable oneness, a merging of being into being, different from the other kind of spiritual experience, the numinous, where one meets the grand, the awe-inspiring other and stands before it quaking because it is so great and you're so small. That is the numinous experience. It is an awakening to the great other power, yes. But the mystic experience is when you get into the secret of being and discover that all is one, that there is no other, there is only that. One does not think oneself to be the entirety of that, but recognizes oneself as a portion, an aspect, a ray of that more brilliant light. So those who would have the illumined mind as a home would be more capable of that kind of immediate contact without having to use thought to express, would be substantially in tune with that. They live in that light. They rise in that light. That is really where they're from. But these two stages of the ascent enjoy their authority and can get their own united completeness only by a reference to a third level. For it is from the higher summits where dwells the intuitional being that they derive the knowledge which they turn into thought or sight and bring down to us for the mind's transmutation. Intuition is a power of consciousness, nearer and more intimate to the original knowledge by identity, for it is always something that leaps out direct from a concealed identity. It is when the consciousness of the subject meets with the consciousness in the object, penetrates it and sees, feels, or vibrates with the truth of what it contacts, that the intuition leaps out like a spark or lightning flash from the shock of the meeting. Or when the consciousness, even without any such meeting, looks into itself and feels directly and intimately the truth or the truths that are there, or so contacts the hidden forces behind appearances, then also there is the outbreak of an intuitive light. Or again, when the consciousness meets the supreme reality, or the spiritual reality of things and beings, and has a contactual union with it, then the spark, the flash, or the blaze of intimate truth perception is lit in its depths. So, the objective, based upon the unitive, the subjective, based upon the unitive, rising into the transcendent, based upon the unitive. This close perception is more than sight, more than conception. It is the result of a penetrating and revealing touch, which carries in it sight and conception as part of itself, or as its natural consequence. A concealed or slumbering identity, not yet recovering itself, still remembers or conveys by the intuition its own contents and the intimacy of its self-feeling and self-vision of things, its light of truth, its overwhelming and automatic certitude. In the human mind, the intuition is even such a truth remembrance or truth conveyance, or such a revealing flash or blaze breaking into a great mass of ignorance, or through a veil of nescience. But we have seen that it is subject there to an invading mixture, or a mental coating, or an interception and substitution. There is, too, a manifold possibility of misinterpretation which comes in the way of the purity and fullness of its action. Moreover, there are seeming intuitions on all levels of the being, which are communications rather than intuitions, and these have a very various provenance, value, and character. The infrarational mystic, so styled, for to be a true mystic, it is not sufficient to reject reason and rely on sources of thought or action of which one has no understanding, is often inspired by such communications on the vital level from a dark and dangerous source. In other words, you don't get to be a mystic simply by wandering through the byways of the vital worlds behind the physical. In these circumstances, we are driven to rely mainly on the reason and are disposed even to control the suggestions of the intuition, or the pseudo-intuition, which is the more frequent phenomenon, by the observing and discriminating intelligence. For we feel in our intellectual part that we cannot be sure otherwise what is the true thing and what the mixed or adulterated article or false substitute. But this largely discounts for us the utility of the intuition, for the reason is not in this field a reliable arbiter, since its methods are different, tentative, uncertain, and intellectual seeking, even though it itself really relies on a camouflaged intuition for its conclusions, for without that help it could not choose its course or arrive at any assured finding. It hides this dependence from itself under the process of a reasoned conclusion or a verified conjecture. You'll remember this from chapters far back now, in which Sri Aurobindo established his epistemology, that there is no possibility of reliable human knowledge without the functioning of an intuition from behind which organizes what the rational mind thinks it understands. An intuition, passed in judicial review by the reason, ceases to be an intuition and can only have the authority of the reason, for which there is no inner source of direct certitude. But even if the mind became predominantly an intuitive mind, reliant upon its portion of the higher faculty, the coordination of its cognitions and its separated activities, for in mind these would always be apt to appear as a series of imperfectly connected flashes, would remain difficult so long as this new mentality has not a conscious liaison with its supra-rational source or a self-uplifting access to a higher plane of consciousness in which an intuitive action is pure and native. In other words, if intuition begins to function in the mind of a granted human, it will have flashes of brilliance. It will have moments when it is lit up, but it will not be able to sustain it. There will be chinks. There will be interruptions. And it won't be an entire integrated field of knowledge which the intuitive mind is working in. It would be an advance over the ratiocinative mind, the mind of the philosopher. It would also be an advance over the higher mind established in the thinking mind. But it would not be enough. But now he wants to turn to the real nature of intuition and what it represents. Intuition is always an edge or ray or outleap of a superior light. It is in us a projecting blade, edge, or point of a far-off supermind light entering into and modified by some intermediate truth mind substance above us, and so modified, again entering into and very much blinded by our ordinary or ignorant mind substance. But on that higher level to which it is native, its light is unmixed, and therefore entirely and purely veridical, and its rays are not separated but connected or massed together in a play of waves of what might almost be called in the Sanskrit poetic figure a sea or mass of stable lightnings. So this would remind you of an earlier citation in the Life Divine, hundreds of pages ago, where he describes massive lightnings of flaming sun stuff. Wonderful poetic phrasing. As far as stable lightnings goes, I have not been able to find it in the Rig Veda. What I have found is another apposite phrase, Haskarad Vidyutas, which means laughing lightning. And that's in the first mandala, 23rd hymn, 12th verse. But I could not find a citation for stable lightnings. If any of you locate that, let me know. Many people refer to it and say Sri Aurobindo is drawing from the Veda. Nobody has traced it. They're simply referring back to this page and this phrase. So if you can find this Sanskrit poetic figure, stable lightnings, and lightning here would be vidyut, V-I-D-Y-U-T, vidyut. So the point is that when intuition is able to range in its own sphere and isn't mixed by descent into lower grades of being, when it's in its own realm, it is able to work together from illumination to elimination. The lightnings can be frozen in a moment of eternity, congealed into a vast identity. He goes on. When this original or native intuition begins to descend into us in answer to an ascension of our consciousness to its level, or as a result of our finding of a clear way of communication with it, it may continue to come as a play of lightning flashes, isolated or in constant action. But at this stage, the judgment of reason becomes quite inapplicable. It can only act as an observer or registrar, understanding or recording the more luminous intimations, judgments, and discriminations of the higher power. So if one ascends into the intuitive consciousness, begins to ascend, to connect with, and then to become accustomed to living in intuition itself, then one has to discard the interferences of the lower ranges of mentality. They are not permitted, because then if you're true to the intuition, it will come to you more and more. If it comes to you and you're practicing yoga and you ignore it, it knocks at your door, but you don't give it entry. It may knock again. If you refuse entry again, it may depart. You have to be receptive. You have to know when the intuitive power is coming to you. And it has to work its way in through all the intercessional regions of our being and find its way. And then we have to note it's there. And then as we're able to perceive more and more what it is that is intuitive and what the rest of the intermixture is, we can set the rest aside and attend to intuition as it arrives. The more we have fidelity to it, the more it grows in us. The more its expression through and in us will be authentic and automatic. You won't have to think about it. It will be true. It will, and what you say in such a vision will become true because you are expressing something that is based on the unity of being. So let's go on. To complete or verify an isolated intuition or discriminate its nature, its application, its limitations, the receiving consciousness must rely on another completing intuition or be able to call down a massed intuition capable of putting all in place. So, intuition is an edge or a ray of that supermind light, but to establish a larger truth, intuition can be coupled with intuition, can be trebled with yet another intuition, etc., etc. One can build a mass of intuitions which establish a hold of truth over the area governed. For once the process of the change has begun, a complete transmutation of the stuff and activities of the mind into the substance, form, and power of intuition is imperative. Until then, so long as the process of consciousness depends upon the lower intelligence serving or helping out or using the intuition, the result can only be a survival of the mixed knowledge-ignorance, uplifted or relieved by a higher light and force acting in its parts of knowledge. So we thereby limit the force and effectivity of intuition. Intuition has a fourfold power. A power of revelatory truth-seeing, ila. A power of inspiration or truth-hearing, saraswati. A power of truth-touch, or immediate seizing of significance, which is akin to the ordinary nature of its intervention in our mental intelligence, a power of true and automatic discrimination of the orderly and exact relation of truth to truth. These are the fourfold potencies of intuition. Intuition can therefore perform all the action of reason, including the function of logical intelligence, which is to work out the right relation of things and the right relation of idea with idea, but by its own superior process and with steps that do not fail or falter. It takes up also and transforms into its own substance not only the mind of thought, but the heart and life and the sense and physical consciousness. Already, all these have their own peculiar powers of intuition derivative from the hidden light. The pure power descending from above can assume them all into itself and impart to these deeper heart perceptions and life perceptions and the divinations of the body a greater integrality and perfection. It can thus change the whole consciousness into the stuff of intuition, for it brings its own greater radiant movement into the will, into the feelings and emotions, the life impulses, the action of sense and sensation, the very workings of the body consciousness. It recasts them in the light and power of truth and illumines their knowledge and their ignorance. A certain integration can thus take place, but whether it is a total integration must depend on the extent to which the new light is able to take up the subconscient and penetrate the fundamental inconscience. Here, the intuitive light and power may be hampered in its task because it is the edge of a delegated and modified supermind, but does not bring in the whole mass or body of the identity knowledge. The basis of inconscience in our nature is too vast, deep, and solid to be altogether penetrated, turned into light, transformed by an inferior power of the truth nature. But still, the intuitivization of the being is a tremendous step forward. And you see it in the very physical bearing of Sri Aurobindo, of the mother, of some of their great disciples like Kapali Shastriya, who in his mind could write authentically about any reach of human knowledge, who could sit quietly and suddenly the atmosphere around him would be felicitous, simply from the outflowing of the power of his being. Working at the timber go down could simply stretch out his hand, and if somebody needed a pound of nails, scoop with one hand, set it on the scale, it would be a pound of nails. So all of the body, mind, heart, and the physicality itself, reflecting the power of this dominion of intuition as it establishes itself in the nature. No, it isn't enough to change things all the way down to the inconscient. For that, we have to have the whole power, the whole reach of the supramental. But it is a great step. And for evolutionary humanity to advance beyond, let's say, the suzerainty of the thought mind and arrive at an intuitive consciousness and leading would mean a great bridge in humanity towards the supramental. Perhaps that is the next rung on the ladder for some. Well, let's turn from the stable lightnings, the massed lightnings of the life divine to Savitri now. We'll continue next week. This is from Book 1, the Book of Beginnings. Canto 3, the Yoga of the Soul's Release. And this is the section that led up to the section that I read last time. Pardon me. In every hour loosed from the quiver of time, there rose a song of new discovery, a bow twang's hum of young experiment. Each day was a spiritual romance, as if he was born into a bright new world. Adventure leaped an unexpected friend, and danger brought a keen, sweet tang of joy. Each happening was a deep experience. There were high encounters, epic colloquies, and counsels came couched in celestial speech, and honeyed pleadings breathed from occult lips to help the heart to yield to rapture's call. And sweet temptations stole from beauty's realms, and sudden ecstasies from a world of bliss. It was a region of wonder and delight. All now his bright clairaudience could receive, a contact thrilled of mighty unknown things. Awakened to new unearthly closenesses, the touch replied to subtle infinities, and with a silver cry of opening gates, sight's lightnings leaped into the invisible. Ever his consciousness and vision grew. They took an ampler sweep, a loftier flight. He passed the border marked for matter's rule, and passed the zone where thought replaces life. Out of this world of signs, suddenly he came into a silent self where world was not, and looked beyond into a nameless vast. These symbol figures lost their right to live. All tokens dropped our sense can recognize. There the heart beat no more at body's touch. There the eyes gazed no more on beauty's shape. In rare and lucent intervals of hush, into a signless region he could soar, packed with the deep contents of formlessness, where world was into a single being wrapped, and all was known by the light of identity, and spirit was its own self-evidence. The Supreme's gaze looked out through human eyes, and saw all things and creatures as itself, and knew all thought and word as its own voice. There unity is too close for search and clasp, and love is a yearning of the one for the one, and beauty is a sweet difference of the same, and oneness is the soul of multitude. There all the truths unite in a single truth, and all ideas rejoin reality. There, knowing herself by her own termless self, wisdom supernal, wordless, absolute, sat uncompanioned in the eternal calm, all-seeing, motionless, sovereign, and alone. There, knowledge needs not words to embody idea. Idea, seeking a house in boundlessness, weary of its homeless immortality, asks not in thought's carved brilliant cell to rest, whose single window's clipped outlook on things sees only a little arc of God's vast sky. The boundless with the boundless there consorts, while there one can be wider than the world, while there one is one's own infinity. His center was no more in earthly mind. A power of seeing silence filled his limbs. Caught by a voiceless white epiphany into a vision that surpasses forms, into a living that surpasses life, he neared the still consciousness sustaining all. Namaste. Jai Ma.